Welcome to Explore Climate Dynamics Models. My name is Kareem Shishakli, and I'm very happy to be here today with Steve Adler and Rick Myski to talk about this exciting new project, which we're going to introduce with a hackathon at the International System Dynamics Conference next week in Delft, Netherlands. Here's Steve Adler to explain more about this to you.
Thanks, Kareem, and thanks everyone for joining this morning. I'm really excited that we've had such a terrific turnout. I think this is a really exciting opportunity. As Kareem said, I'm Steve Adler, and Kareem and I have been collaborating for years on system dynamics. We were co-chairs in the XMile System Dynamics Standards Technical Committee and worked together to create the world's first system dynamics standard. And next week in Delft, we'll be collaborating again as we work together to help the world build predictive models to understand the impact of climate change on our societies. When it comes to climate change, we often hear governments talking about emissions controls, and there's already been some fantastic work in the system dynamics community to try to understand how national commitments on fossil fuel emissions are contributing to climate change around the world. For this exercise, we want to focus on a different challenge, a different problem statement. And it's the challenge that climate change is happening. We see it in polar ice caps, we see it in increased storm activity, we see it in drought, we see it in increased hurricanes and tornadoes and storms around the world. And we see it in insurance claims, we see it in catastrophic damage. But there's some areas where climate change is impacting our society that we're not capturing in either data or models, and we're consequently not adequately prepared in many communities around the world for the sociological, economic, for the social science impacts of climate change on our societies. In a little while, we'll ask Rick Myski to talk about some of his perceptions at the Department of Defense about how climate change is affecting concerns for national security both at home and abroad. I wanted to talk a little bit about the purpose of the hackathon next week and why we're organizing it. It's to try to identify the tertiary consequences of subtle, incremental, and sudden climate changes on our communities and environments. Normally, when we think about the impacts of climate change, we think about storms, tornadoes, and we think about catastrophic loss models that insurance companies have developed, which measure the impact of these meteorological events on infrastructure and property. But there are other types of consequences of climate change that are outside the catastrophic loss models that we see occurring, like Hurricane Katrina, which hit the United States and Louisiana and the Gulf Coast in 2006, didn't just cause widespread damage and flooding, it also caused huge migrations of human beings out of the Delta into 50 other states across the United States. And a lot of those migrations were not tracked in models. We didn't keep comprehensive records of where those people went. How many days of school did they miss? What was the economic impact of their changes in behavior? What products did they buy? What products did they stop buying? What businesses closed down? What days of school did kids miss? What was the healthcare impact? Those types of non-catastrophic, non-meteorological consequences of climate change are not currently being tracked. We don't have adequate models for tracking them, and so we're often not prepared to understand how we should react as our climate changes, as we face drought, as we face changing wind patterns, as we face increased levels of pollution because of changing wind patterns, as we face forest fires, and a whole variety of other issues like warming oceans and melting of polar ice caps and rising seas. Nobody is looking at all of these issues on a comprehensive basis. There is no model out there that is trying to understand how climate change is affecting the layers, the onion layers of human society. Now that's a big task, but I think there's one discipline in the world that can help elucidate these challenges, and I think that's a system dynamics discipline. And so I'm asking the System Dynamics Society and all the participants who are joining us in Delft next week to put their thinking caps on and help us develop an open source, open community model using online tools and XMile, which is an open source standard, to try to begin to document the tertiary consequences of climate change on our societies and try to begin to model out how we might envision future changes to affect our communities as both educational tools for ourselves as well as public planning tools for policymakers, for businesses, and communities around the world. I'll talk a little bit later about how we might structure that work, but now I'd like to ask my friend Rick Myski to give us a perspective which I don't think many of us fully appreciate, which is how climate change is affecting the thinking around national security and how the Department of Defense is thinking about climate change and how that might shape our collaboration together next week and our thinking beyond that. Rick, can you walk us through your thinking on this topic? Introduce yourself and share with the team what you guys are working on.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Steve. So welcome, everybody, and thank you for this opportunity. That was a great intro, Steve, and I think it makes me really think, before we get into these slides here, what we're really seeing inside of DoD that's not mentioned in my presentation here is DoD is really starting to understand systems of systems and systems theory as it's laid out. And one of the guys that we're leveraging is Capra and some of his ideas on how systems of systems work. So I don't mention that in my presentations here, but that's some of the key theory that we're looking at and saying, okay, these onion peels, they all interact and interrelate. So as we get into this future modeling, this complex system, it's very important to DoD, and I want to explain why. So my name's Rick Myski. I'm 29 years in the service, about 27 of that running programs for DoD to do national security. About the past probably 15 years, I've been involved in modeling, human behavior modeling, and bringing subject matter experts to the table with the scientists and the technologists to build capabilities that DoD can leverage to understand the future. The project that I run is a small project, Rapid Integrated Strategic Assessment. That's not the real key point to the talk here, though. I just want to lay out a few things about why this project is significant and why systems thinking and what we're getting after might influence how you as a community understand what we're thinking about and maybe what you might be able to leverage that might benefit militaries around the world. Water security as it pertains to DoD, we'll briefly touch on that. Then I want to talk about this framework that we're using. It's a social ecological model. It incorporates our systems thinking as we like to see it, and then the future need for global security. So first of all, we're focused on water and water security as it's defined in our project by the United Nations. And it's quite interesting to me that throughout our military, the United States military, we have not and do not have a current understanding globally about water and the crisis of water as it is pertain to conflict in the population centers around the world. We find that this is a Popular Science article, so I've lifted this from the Popular Science magazine, and we have everybody else who's starting to understand systems thinking but DoD. We're a little bit late to the game. This right here is showing us basically why water security is a challenge for DoD. If you take a look at these hot spots around the world, and then the concentric circles replicate the amount of conflict around those locations as it pertains to water. And you can kind of see an overlay of other conflict and regional economic and political strife that might be happening in those same areas. So this is very sophisticated. This is a basic map, of course, but when you start peeling this onion back, there's so many variables to be analyzed and looked at that it's no wonder the DoD can't do it, right? We're not very good at that complexity, especially when you get at the operational level. So again, Popular Science is putting this together. DoD to date has yet to put anything significant like this on the table to say it's a capability to map future conflicts related to this issue. Next slide here, we're going to talk a little bit about populations and the secure populations, stable populations that we like to call it. We've seen the crisis in Syria spike. We're starting to see the beginnings of a crisis in Sao Paulo, Brazil. Although it's muted right now for the purpose of the Olympics, we're going to probably see some stuff afterwards. It all began with water, drought, environmental issues, which came from climate change. I've included some links there. I'm not going to go into details about how the drought caused problems in Syria, but we're seeing this in hotspots around the world to include places along the Mekong, Brazil, and Syria. And so having a better understanding of this pre-conflict is a significant thing for the Department of Defense. Breaking out the variables, understanding the interrelationships and the boundaries and the feedback loops is something the DoD really needs to get into, and we're pushing that way. But we're not as sophisticated as the corporate and other industries. One last note here, it's not just the drought that they're talking about in Syria and Brazil and these other population centers around the world, it's also the governance and the management of and the policy of those droughts and the infrastructure and the economics around it. So security as a nexus for DoD, we look at it through, this is just a basic lens, the human security, the environmental security, and the climate security. And where all of those come together, DoD is starting to take a vast interest and investment in understanding this domain. I'm going to go kind of fast here. I'm just assuming that everybody can get those slides later as well. Particular to us as Department of Defense, human security is the biggest focus, and we're starting to really understand that the climate is having a major impact and can be a forecaster for us. Anticipatory analytics, things like that, and the modeling is exactly what we're trying to get after with existing research and programs. So again, this is the definition of our water security problem as we see it around the world. Water security defined by the United Nations. We're looking at good governance, transboundary cooperation, so the policy and management. We're looking at peace and political stability in those regions and the variables that connect that. And then, of course, the financing, right? Who's involved with funding or making money off water, extraction, you know, and various other UN aspects of funding the populations and the governments and the water issues. So just real quick, so as you as systems dynamic modeling experts, these are some key variables I think might be of interest to you in the future. So why for DoD? Why is this such a big deal? Now, water security is just the beginning project. We're moving our next project. We're going to be looking at food and energy as the security nexus key variables. So U.S. military planning and decision makers currently do not have any way or the staff to really get in and crack at this problem set and understand it. They don't have the ability to visualize it. They don't have any analytics built that helps them get after the large, vast amounts of data that's open source on the web, in social media, to identify knowledge gaps or sentiment around populations or other variables that might impact the forecast or anticipatory knowledge of a region. So we're trying to, our project's introducing methods to collect, process, analyze, and visualize these various silos of data in a way that we can visualize and tell the narrative around existing environmental issues. And we're focused on water for right now. So a little bit about the framework. I think this might have and might be a good takeaway for the modelers out there. We're using what we call the Dipsi Framework. This is a socio-ecological systems perspective about the environment, and we're looking at the drivers, pressures, states, impacts, and then the response. There's a little bit of debate within our team and others about what type of response are we talking about. Is it the response that we desire to have against those variables, or is it the response that results out of those variables? And in our case, we're taking the stance that it's the results that we want to get, that we would like to craft and model and understand and then choose a result that's best for the population, for that government. So as everybody can see, you can take urbanization as a driver, and you can walk it through gas emissions that get expelled into the atmosphere, and then that is going to end up degrading air quality as a state of that current environment. And then the impacts, of course, might be a decline in biodiversity or altered ecosystem, or also or all of the above, human health and socioeconomic impacts. So with that, then you say, well, what result are you trying to get? And then how do you backwalk and understand these variables and interactions between to get to the result that you want? And you want to advise that government in their policy, their politics, and the execution of drought. Next slide. Just real quick, for a military perspective, we're trying to break things down. We've taken a complex stability variables of a population as they interact with water and the water security definition, and we've identified some of these as key variables that we're trying to understand and extract from the web. In essence, we're trying to model, collect the data to get ready for a nice Dipsi model that we could understand and visualize in a way that hasn't been done before. My point in showing this to you as this audience is this is where we start cracking open the onion and say, well, what is it? Cessation of violence? What are the variables there? What's the data telling us? What's physical protection? What's territorial security? What's the legal framework around water? Institutional vulnerability for that government, local governments, all the way down to the city, right? What are the enabling environment, right? What's there? Pollution, global health, and you can continue to go around. So we're working with a defined set of knowledge that we're trying to map to. Yours might be different for the different environment that you're looking at. This is what we're looking at in our project. And then we want to be able to summarize that in a real simple fashion that makes sense to a military person that's going to make decisions. So we built this, and by the way, this is live data that we pushed through a decision model. It's been extracted open source from the web, and we're trying to advise the planners in the Pacific Command what their key countries might look like within their region as relates to water security. Now, by no means has this got 100% certainty to it, but this is a starting point for our team to inform decision makers and planners at the staff levels. And with that, I'm not sure what my time hack was. I ran through that pretty fast. Steve, is there anything else you would like me to highlight and mention reference to the climate change, the impacts of DoD, how we're trying to get after some of this?
Rick, that was really good. And actually, I wonder if we could go back to slide 8 for a moment. Let me see, am I able to do that? Yeah.
I got it.
Slide 8, yeah. And so for all my system dynamics colleagues on the phone, Rick, you've divided these things up into drivers, pressures, state, and impacts. From a system dynamics perspective, we might look at these as stocks of things that might change, that might accrete or decrete, and feedback loops. So the list that you provided here is extremely helpful. I wonder if you alluded to the Syria conflict early in the presentation, and I wonder if we might not, since that, for those who are on the phone, let me walk through this scenario that I think I've understood, and Rick, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but what I understood was that there's a current theory, well-founded theory, that the civil war in Syria had its origins in a severe drought the country faced from 2006 and 7, which caused the collapse of their agricultural sector, which resulted in widespread migrations of agricultural workers, farmers, into cities, and which changed both the ethnic makeup of the cities as well as put economic pressures on communities. And those pressures created, oh look, you have a chart all about it. Those pressures created a very tense situation, and during 2007 and 8, with the collapse of the global economy from the credit crisis, with a rise in food prices from devaluation of currencies and the Arab Spring in 2010, that erupted into civil war. It isn't to say that climate change caused civil war, but it created a cascading impact that the government was not able to monitor, and so they were not able to anticipate how crowding in cities could lead to social unrest that could be fomented by something like the Arab Spring in Egypt. And I wonder if we go back to slide 8 and we look at some of the items that you've listed there, some of what I call stocks or flows, and perhaps do a little scenario analysis. Are there things we learned from Syria that are not on this list? And how would we wish to think about these items? Do we think that Syria is an isolated incident? It looks like from your last chart, as you look at the specific command, you don't think that it is. So what would be your ask of us as we now try to think of systems and in their interrelationships, the relationship between socioeconomic impacts and climatological changes? What should we do with this information? And I put that to you, but I also put it more broadly to the community. Kareem, are we allowed to invite participants to ask questions and interact with this content that we've presented?
Yes, certainly. And there already are some questions, but I don't want to derail you yet.
Okay, so Rick, let me ask you then to simply comment on that, and then perhaps we can go to the Q&A session.
So first of all, this framework that we're using is a social ecological model that's been created by others in the industry, in the academic field. It's not a DoD created framework. Okay. We've adapted it to our project for the understanding the complexity of the interrelationships between the drivers, pressures, states, and impacts. Now, to answer your question about showing some type of correlation and understanding of maybe some pieces that might have been in Dara, Syria, as people moved and the different variables that might be represented in that situation. This list that you see here is not the whole list, of course, right? There's so many other variables. And in some cases, we found that taking a look at some of these variables, they could be divided up in a variety of different ways. It just depends on your perspective of that framework. From a DoD perspective, we really are just so far behind the power curve in understanding about how to look forward at those. The key variables and understanding that I think that we should have is the key drivers of, right now, DoD is not fully accepting that drought and water has such a major impact that they need to be too concerned about it, right? So first of all, understanding that drought, climate, and the impacts of that on economics, population movements, and governance, those key variables, those key things right there coming out of some type of research or modeling effort is significant to DoD, because then we'll put more vested interest in dollars behind projects that will try to incorporate that understanding into a capability. I think it would be very interesting to get a team of folks together and say, hey, let's redo Syria. Let's go back and let's model that and look at the population sentiment, the farmers, the rural areas as they moved. Then let's, which we can't really collect that because they're probably not all on social media at the time and even now. And then look at the different variables that presented themselves as you got into a dense population. Economics rose because they have less protein, less food, right? And then after that, conflict starts because there's more people, infrastructure starts to break apart. Then religion comes in. So those are all key things that are worth looking at and having a greater understanding. The hard part is making it available in a visual way that military people can understand it, have faith in it, understand the certainty behind it, and it doesn't have to be 100% certainty. They're willing to take a 60 or 70% certainty, but they need to understand that. And then to be able to run a Monte Carlo and go back and forth and look at the differences of a model brings greater understanding to that decision maker to say, wow, social, ecological issues with the economics of the restaurants, and then now the governance, and now the strife inside of at the neighborhood level, what was happening. That's a pretty significant understanding that DoD would love to get after.
I think all of us would, to be honest. And I think you're right. I think we're fortunate that we have, well, it's unfortunate for the world that Syria has become such a disaster. And it's unfortunate for the Syrian people and for all the countries that are accepting refugees. But from an analytical perspective, we're fortunate to have this model, this experience, because it provides an archetype that we can evaluate. And while Syria has resulted in a civil war and a breakdown of the key structures of governance, which means that critical data collection is probably not available. It's also not the most open society. So things like census records about migrations and agricultural records about productivity and yield, I don't expect that we're going to find a lot of data about that. I might be wrong. It might be that the UN has compiled information about that. But we might at least be able to identify the types of stocks or the types of things that have occurred, the consequences, the tertiary consequences, the feedback loops, and test it against the Syrian scenario to see if the models we develop are accurate. And then perhaps extrapolate that out to other countries that are facing other drought conditions and try to make predictions. So it at least provides, what you've given us and what we can look at from the historical record is an analytical framework, and that's really helpful.
Right. Now, I do have to say that it is imperative that DoD really starts to understand this. It's also imperative that we not just go back and look backwards, but we quickly start to look ahead. And I'm going to tell you what we're seeing now from a hotspot perspective. Sao Paulo, Brazil, countries involved in the damming of the upper Mekong and then the effects in the lower Mekong region. You're looking at South Africa and the Orange water basin, right? And then Egypt and the Sudan, the water stuff is between those two countries. So some other hotspots that exist, but those are the ones that we're kind of seeing right now. And so the sooner we can get after and look at those hotspots in the future, based on the architecture of one that's happened in the past that we can measure against, is very significant. And I think that there is going to be DoD investment in that space. Of course, it depends on who and how our government is run after this next election, but I think there's still going to be vested interest and investment in that space.
Well, thank you for a very thought-provoking presentation. Why don't we open up the floor and perhaps see if we have any questions. It sounds like we do. Kareem?
Before we start, there were some questions. Probably the easiest one that you alluded to, Steve, that you'd come back to, is can you speak more about the challenge and hackathon and where they might find more information about the event and objectives? I put some of the information up here. If you want to add something to that, Steve, before we go on to the questions about the presentation.
Yes, of course. So there is a meetup group. There's a climate data meetup group that was created. It was actually created about a year ago, and there's a meetup page where you can register for participation in the hackathon. Of course, if you haven't registered and you're in Delft and you want to participate, you'll be welcomed anyway. But it would be great if you could join the meetup group and register for the meetup on the page. That helps us for future activities because this hackathon is, I think this is going to be kind of an informational brainstorming hackathon where we explore these topics together and brainstorm how we might define some system dynamics models, both macro level as well as modeling out some of the individual components that we discussed on the phone, like impact on social mobility and impact on economic variables, on agriculture. All of these could be submodels. So the hackathon we have planned next week is really to brainstorm the outline. And beyond the hackathon, we plan to host live and virtual meetings over the next few months to continuously enhance the models we develop, and we plan to showcase these models at a variety of different forums and events. And we, for example, would welcome the opportunity to share modeling work that we've done with Rick and members of the Department of Defense, if that would be appropriate. If they would welcome that, we would love to participate there. And there's some other climate-related events that will be coming up, like Climate Week in New York, like Habitat 3 in Ecuador, in Quito, perhaps at COP22 in Marrakesh. There'll be some other events where we might share some of the work that we're working on and engage with the public on how we help communities prepare for these types of subtle and sudden climate changes and their ability to cause human stress or stress to populations and the impact of that stress on our societies. I think an outcome we all want is to prevent future civil wars and conflict and strife. And so the better prepared the world can be, the more apt it is to be able to prevent things like Syria from ever happening again. And that's our goal.
Thanks, Steve. The next question is, can you say something about the relationship between the increase in natural hazards or catastrophic events and the magnitude of insurance claims? In other words, how much is change in climatic conditions and related extreme events versus how much is the consequence of land use decisions?
I don't know if I feel I can answer that question. Rick, do you have a take on that?
Well, I can't speak to it from an insurance perspective, but I can tell you that the stability of our foreign nation partners, such as, and I'll speak specific to Southeast Asia, we're seeing an uptick in humanitarian activities as a result of climate change, right? Because of the devastation of different storms, tsunamis, floods. So Pacific Command especially is the one that's really caught up in most of that response. Some other commands are doing things too, but not as much as the Pacific Command. So I can't speak to it from an insurance perspective, but there is a significant amount of DoD cost associated with the increase of disaster response or humanitarian assistance, we call it. I don't have any numbers. Somebody could do some research and show the uptick. I do know that the staff out at the Pacific Command has created a what they call all hazards staff section called PACOM J9, and they are focused on understanding that future all hazards to mitigate it early by building partner capacities, which is like an insurance, and giving the regional governments their own capacities to respond with greater capabilities because of the uptick.
Do we have any idea about how much might be due to poor land use decisions, for example, building in low-lying areas or putting a lot of congestion right by the ocean? In particular, disasters, I mean.
We don't. That hasn't been studied, but that's a good question. And that maybe that's something we can pick up as part of the model.
Well, I can speak a little bit to that. We have a modeling effort in ERDIC that's taking a look at flood modeling, and they are doing a little bit of work on that and helping the U.S., which we screw that up pretty bad as well, along with our partner nations, to take a look at the effects of the flood on the land use and the real estate. And so, for instance, like right now, just on the East Coast, one of our major, I won't speak any specifics, one of our major Coast Guard facilities that controls a significant amount of East Coast assets is about 2 feet away from a significant loss of command and control capability. 2 feet of water rise means that the whole base, the whole command is shut down, can't operate. So we are taking a look at some of those things from a DoD perspective, and we're trying to help our partners, but only from a flood modeling perspective. Nobody's doing it from the other aspects, right? All the complexity of the weather, the drought, future storms, and building codes and stuff like that. There's much work needed there. That would be a great tool if we could find a way to show some of the zones that are a no-go for certain type of hazards. That's a significant capability that PACOM would be interested in. I can speak to that.
I think that would be, Rick, and I think you've raised a few good points. I recall after Hurricane Sandy that, there were some of the communities we built in New Jersey and New York with a thought to preventing future storms, but a lot of economic resources were just invested in, rebuilding rooms and partially destroyed homes. And I don't think that outside of Manhattan, there's been some work that's been done to comprehensively think about how to shore up the city, but that's just in the area where Sandy hit. I don't know how widely other cities along the eastern coast are examining their resilience efforts in a comprehensive way and analyzing land use and what areas are at risk. I know that there's been some widespread LIDAR investigations on the Florida Peninsula looking at the permeability of water next to the sea and doing some analysis on which land is most at risk for flooding from increases in temperatures and sea rise, and where to lift roads up by a few inches and so on. But I don't know how. I think that would be an interesting area for us to include in the model as well.
Right. One thing I would submit to the group and to you, Steve, as putting some of these pieces together is you can't just have one technical approach to understanding the complexity, right? It's going to be multiple approaches. We understand that. But there's things outside of the technical that has to happen. And you spoke to it when you said that, other people weren't, they were just looking at that one location. Well, so what's your education model? I mean, what's your education line of effort that you're going to do to educate the rest of the people in that area, right? How do you bring awareness to your activities that you have going on right now globally or regionally? And so what's your campaign to get your knowledge and your experience and your team's efforts out to the key leaders? I do think that leaders today in the military and in the governments are systems thinkers. And if you keep it simple, they will easily adopt your systems view. Yes. And the model outputs.
Well, now you've added another challenge to us, which is keeping it simple, because already we've identified so many complex interrelationships. I think first we'll try to build out the known universe of complexity, and then afterwards we'll try to simplify it.
Right.
What's the next question? Let's keep going.
Great, thank you. A few years ago, Jorgen Randers spoke in Albany, New York, in the United States about his then new book, 2052. One of the questions from the audience was whether he anticipated increased conflict and war as a result of the changes anticipated. He said no, and it was one point that seemed seriously off to me. In a historical sense, I wonder how such conflicts could be avoided. I strongly suspect that we're already seeing some of the effects in the Middle East and the resulting increasing migration patterns.
Yeah, so I think that climate change impacts poor people disproportionately to wealthy societies. Because if you're wealthy, the way we are in the United States, and the temperature rises, you invest in more air conditioning. I'm being simplistic in this analysis, but because we have the resources to invest in resilience, and because we have a governance structure in the United States and Western Europe in which most of our society is well governed. There aren't territories in our countries that are totally outside the control of government. But that's not true for many other countries around the world. In many countries, more than half of their land is not governed. They don't have the capacity and resources to feed their people. And for those societies, resisting climate change is going to be extremely difficult. Preparing, understanding the consequences, finding the economic resources, it's going to be extremely difficult. The first step, of course, is knowledge and providing awareness, and that's something we can contribute to. But the economic challenges will remain.
But Steve, I think there's another point there about the history and the data about conflict throughout history as we see it up to this point, and then what's being forecasted going forward. There's a lot of controversy out there. A lot of people are saying there's not as much conflict around water, food, and stuff today as there has been in the past. They say it's not a rising conflict, and I honestly don't know the answer to that because I haven't seen the data. I mean, so what does the past 50 years of true conflict data around environmental issues look like? And I don't think that anybody has really taken a significant look at that I know of to say that it's on the uptake, it's increasing, or it's decreasing.
Good point.
And that's not a difficult study.
Yeah, good point. Next question, Kareem.
Yeah, there are a lot of comments pointing to some resources that might be helpful, one of which is Dennis Sherwood's book on systems thinking, Seeing the Forest for the Trees, where he has a high-level CLD that links climate change with the environment, famine, and war. But there are other things that are referenced that we can look at later that might help us. There's a general question about whether the model will be based on the framework on slide 8. My understanding was that that is a reference to help us get started with some of the impacts and variables involved. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think it's a very helpful slide, and I would hope that that begins as a framework that we can discuss, and that I would hope that the team would discover additional stocks and variables and feedback loops that aren't on the slide, and we'll add to it.
Right. The one thing that was a model that was created in '96, I believe. It was updated in 2012 for coastal and some coastal and shelf science. The reference to that is on that slide at the top, Sikovsky. So you want to definitely dial back in to read a social ecological framework or model. They have more details about what that looks like. This is just to caption it for our military. This was created by them, the graphic, and it's to summarize in simple fashion to our decision makers so we can get funding and they can understand some of the complexity we're talking about.
Great.
Great, thank you. More general question or broader question, is this effort relating to climate change being set in the context of the need for the emergence of a functioning global community? And a secondary question from the same person related to that is, how do you let the military become a benevolent resource to the world?
Oh, well, I'm not going to touch. Let me go back to the last question later. Yes, you know, there are growing international communities that are working on resilience and indicators around climate change. Part of that is from the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, in which climate change is one of the goals, or there are a number of goals related to climate change, and so there are a number of nations that are beginning to track indicators related to climate change. Part of it is from COP21 and the national commitments that have been made to emissions control and the need for increased audit and transparency of those emissions and the relationship to preparedness for climate change. But I don't think that all those things are around national commitments and statistical tracking. I don't think that there is a global analytical community that is trying to model out how small and large changes in weather patterns and climate are going to impact our societies, with the important debate around those changes and the accuracy of forecasting models. I don't think that's there, and I hope that together we can create the kernel of that community, because I think it's a really important responsibility of all meteorological of hard and soft science professionals. It's something that I think we have to foster in the world because these answers are not going to be easy to come by. Most people work in small stovepipes. We work in highly specialized areas. We don't connect the dots well. One of the great things about systems thinking is it's all about connecting dots. And when it comes to our planet and how heat is impacting our environment and our world, we have to connect the dots. We are the community to do that.
Hey Steve, one note there, you talked about, you know, this soft and hard science coming together and the different technicians in science. Do not leave out the community of practitioners of the application of it, right? For instance, so if you just leave it in the science domain, you're going to miss out on the people that implement the policy, the people that implement the decisions, right, or make the decisions. You're going to need to definitely increase their value add and their perspective and then their takeaway, right? How are they taking your capability you developed, your model outputs, your ideas. I think I heard something in that question about benevolence of DoD to the global community or to the world. Is that correct?
Yes, there was that. Yes, there was.
So, Department of Defense, you know, armies are built to be warfighting machines. And, you know, sometimes the real world doesn't really want to hear that. But with that, we are seeing a transition, like I've said earlier, that, you know, our DoD in the United States is becoming more systems thinking at the grand scale of the globe, the environment, the universe, right? Really, I mean, it's moving. It's almost more yin energy than we've ever seen, and that's kind of good. So what I think the benevolence of, I mean, what we're seeing is DoD is investing in understanding this environmental space. They are investing in creating capabilities that will prevent DoD from, and our partners from making major mistakes in the future, and helping our partners prevent some of those same mistakes from an environmental and a population stability, so we can minimize those conflict points and keep stability. I think that as those capabilities continue to get invested and performed at a very micro scale compared to what some other U.S. government agencies might be doing or other countries, other governments, our DoD is investing. I'm one of about probably 15 projects that I know of that are focused on the environment right now.
Yeah, and Rick, I would guess that, as you said, avoiding conflict is a benevolent outcome. But there are other government agencies that are also concerned with avoiding conflict. USAID is concerned with it. State Department is concerned with it. USDA is concerned with agricultural loss and food security around the world. So I think, you know, our government has many government departments, and other governments do as well, who are concerned about food security and habitat loss and biodiversity loss and a whole variety of other factors that climate change are tertiary consequences of climate change. So it isn't just DoD.
Right. Now, the other thing I do want to add to the DoD slice of that, we are going deep in the aspect of we're taking what we're learning through the little research projects and we're implementing that back into our military education system.
Wow.
So we can get the brains of the young people educated early about systems thinking, water, food, energy, the environment, you know, our footprint in base camps around the world. And by the way, we're already influencing the United Nations and how they look at constructing base camps and what their environmental scan is prior to the base camp and then their environmental scan after the base camp, from everything from water to trash to, you know, waste of all types, and make sure we leave no leftovers. And environmental disaster perspective, because that has not been measured in the past, and we're increasing that. And but that's getting more at the tactical level of things, right? We're even creating systems now in our own DoD that are self-contained bio-waste systems and water treatment and water systems, so they're recycled, so we don't have to suck off of the local populations too much from a water perspective or a food perspective. We're able to create some of that, manage it, and recycle it ourselves.
Wow.
Thank you, Rick. Those are really great answers. Steve, logistic question we addressed very briefly. How can people who are not attending the conference in Delft provide input ahead of time and after this meeting?
Certainly, the Climate Data Meetup group has a forum. You can post comments to the team. You can include resources. There's a place where you can deposit things you want us to look at. We will, since the models will be created in an online open source tool, everything that is created in terms of models will be available during and after the event. We will also take notes and share those notes publicly as well. And I think we'll organize another follow-up webinar a week after the conference to debrief all of us that participated and allow those who couldn't participate to learn what was discussed and what the next steps are.
Okay, I think that's about all we have time for. There are a couple more questions, but I think we should probably wrap it up at this point. I think it's been a really great session. I think very informative. I'm very excited about next week and our first open source hackathon in system dynamics, and I hope to see a lot of you there. I hope to see a lot of you joining the meetup. Steve, do you have some closing words?
I want to thank Rick especially for an extremely interesting and thought-provoking presentation. You really sparked my imagination and inspired me, and I'm really grateful for your participation and for everybody who was able to participate today. I think we had 165 total who joined us in the middle of summer. Thank you for your interest and your passion, and I look forward to working together with you next week in Delft and for many weeks and months after. Thank
Steve,
put this together.
Yeah, I just have one last thing I'd like to challenge everybody with. As you do your work, as you do your hackathon or your future work inside of this systems dynamics, really have a vision of, and I want you to put yourself in the shoes of that local city leader, that local government leader, or the national government leader, or that military person you want to take your information. Put yourself in their shoes and think about what do they need to see to make better decisions. And if you approach your work backwards from that perspective of what's in their tacit mind, how they process information, and what they need to see to make better, rapid, more deeper decisions than they've ever done before, walk it backwards from their brain into yours and produce your work with that as an end result in mind.
Good advice. Thank you. Good advice.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Rick. That was wonderful.
Thank you guys for having me on here. It's been a pleasure.
It's been terrific. A great, great conversation. And thanks for everyone for their great questions. And I hope we'll have more questions next week. And thanks again, Kareem, for organizing us.